Why were you so backward in joining them? The same reason that caused me not to mix with them for years before. I saluted them on coming up, and I asked, well, how come? How came he there? He answered his life was worth no more than the others, and his liberty was just as dear to him. I asked him if he thought to obtain it. He said he would, or he'd lose his life, and that was enough to put me in full confidence of him. Jack, I knew, was only a tool in the hands of Hark. It was quickly agreed we should commence at home, Mr. J. Travis, on that night, and until we had armed and equipped ourselves and gathered sufficient force, neither age nor sex was to be spared, which was invariably adhered to. We remained at the feast until about 2 hours in the night. When we went to the house and found Austin, they all went to the cider press and drank except myself. On returning to the house, Hark went to the door with an axe for the purpose of breaking it open, as we knew we were strong enough to murder the family if they were awaked by the noise, but reflecting that it might create an alarm in the neighborhood, we determined to enter the house secretly and murder them while sleeping. Hark got a ladder and set it against the chimney, on which I ascended, and hoisting a window, entered and came downstairs, unbarred the door, removed the guns from their places. It was then observed that I must spill the first blood, on which, armed with a hatchet and accompanied by a will, I entered my master's chamber. It being dark, I could not give a death blow. The hatchet glanced from his head. He sprang from the bed and called his wife. It was his last word. Will laid him dead with a blow of his axe, and Mrs. Travis shared the same fate as she lay in bed. The murder of this family, 5 in number, was the work of a moment. Not one of them awoke. There was a little infant sleeping in a cradle that was forgotten until we had left the house and gone some distance. When Will and Henry returned and killed it, we got here 4 guns that would shoot and several old muskets with a pound or 2 of powder. We remained some time at the bar where we paraded. I formed them in a line as soldiers, and after carrying them through all the maneuvers I was master of, marched them off to Mr. Salathul Francis, about 600 yards distant. Sam and Will went to the door and knocked. Mr. Francis asked who was there. Sam replied it was him, and he had a letter for him, on which he got up and came to the door. They immediately seized him, and dragging him out a little from the door, he was dispatched by repeated blows on the head. There was no other white person in the family. We started from there for Mrs. Reese's, maintaining the most perfect silence on our march, where, finding the door unlocked, we entered and murdered Mrs. Reese in her bed while sleeping. Her son awoke, but it was only to sleep the sleep of death. He had only time to say, "Who is that?" And then he was no more. From Mrs. Reese's, we went to Mrs. Turner's, a mile distant, which we reached about sunrise on Monday morning. Henry, Austin, and Sam went to the still, where, finding Mr. Peebles, Austin shot him, and the rest of us went to the house. As we approached, the family discovered us and shut the door. Vain hope! Will, with one stroke of his axe, opened it, and we entered and found Mrs. Turner and Mrs. Newsom in the middle of the room, almost frightened to death. Will immediately killed Mrs. Turner with one blow of his axe. I took Mrs. Newsom by the hand, and with the sword I had when I was apprehended, I struck her several blows over the head, but not being able to kill her, as the sword was dull. Will, turning around and discovering it, dispatched her also. A general destruction of property, search for money and ammunition, always succeeded the murders. By this time, my company amounted to 15, and 9 men mounted who started for Mrs. Whitehead's. The other 6 were to go through a byway to Mr. Bryant's and rejoin us at Mrs. Whitehead's. As we approached the house, we discovered Mr. Richard Whitehead standing in the cotton patch. He was in the cotton patch near the lane fence. We called him over into the lane, and Will, the executioner, was near at hand with his fatal axe to send him to an untimely grave. As we pushed on to the house, I discovered someone run around the garden, and thinking it was some of the White family, I pursued them, but finding it was a servant girl belonging to the house, I returned to commence the work of death. But they whom I left had not been idle. All the family were already murdered, but Mrs. Whitehead and her daughter Margaret. As I came round to the door, I saw Will pulling Mrs. Whitehead out of the house, and at the step he nearly severed her head from her body with his broad axe. Miss Margaret, when I discovered her, had concealed herself in the corner formed by the projection of the cellar cap from the house. On my approach, she fled but was soon overtaken. And after repeated blows with the sword, I killed her by a blow on the head with a fence rail. By this time, the 6 who had gone by Mr. Bryant's rejoined us and informed me that they had done the work of death assigned them. We again divided, part going to Mr. Richard Porter's, and from thence to Nathaniel Francis, the others to Mr. Hal Harris's and Mr. T. Doyle's. On reaching Mr. Porter's, we had escaped with his family. He had escaped with his family. I understood there that the alarm had already spread, and I immediately returned to bring up those sent to Mr. Doyle's and Mr. Hal Harris. The party I left going on to Mr. Francis's, having told them I would join them in that neighborhood. I met these sent to Mr. Doyle's and Mr. Harris's, returning, having met Mr. Doyle on the road and killed him. And learning from some who joined them that Mr. Harris was from home, I immediately pursued the course taken by the party gone on before, but knowing they had complete the work of death and pillage at Mr. Francis's, before I could get there, I went to Mr. Peter Edwards's, expecting to find them there, but they had been here also. I then went to Mr. John T. Barrows. They had been here and murdered him. I pursued on their track to Captain Newitt Harris's, where I found the greater part mounted and ready to start. The men, now mounting to about 40, shouted and heard as I rode up. Hurried, somewhere in the yard, loading their guns, other drinking. They said Captain Harris and his family had escaped the property in the house they destroyed, robbing him of money and other valuables. I ordered them to mount and march instantly. This was 9 or 10 o'clock Monday morning. I proceeded to Mr. Levi Waller's. Mr. Levi Waller's, 2 or 3 miles distance. I took my station in the rear, and as it was my object to carry terror and devastation wherever we went, I placed 15 or 20 of the best armed and most to be relied on in front, who generally approached the houses as fast as their horses could run. This is for 2 purposes: to prevent their escape and strike terror to the inhabitants. On this account, I never got to the houses after leaving Mrs. Whitehead's until the murders were committed, except in one case. I sometimes got in sight in time to see the work of death completed, viewed the mangled bodies as they lay in silent satisfaction, and immediately started in quest of other victims. Having murdered Mrs. Waller and 10 children, we started for Mr. William Williams's. Having killed him and 2 little boys that were there while engaged in this, Mrs. Williams fled and got some distance from the house, but she was pursued, overtaken, and compelled to get up behind one of the company, who brought her back, and after showing her the mangled body of her lifeless husband, she was told to get down and lay by his side, where she was shot dead. I then started for Mr. Jacob Williams, where the family were murdered. Here we found a young man named Drury, who had come on business with Mr. Williams. He was pursued, overtaken, and shot. Mrs. Vaughn was the next place we visited, and after murdering the family there, I determined on starting for Jerusalem. Our number amounted now to 50 or 60, all mounted and armed with guns, axes, swords, clubs. On reaching Mr. James W. Parker's gate, immediately on the road leading to Jerusalem and about 3 miles distant, it was proposed to me to call there, but I objected, as I knew he was gone to Jerusalem, and my object was to reach there as soon as possible. But some of the men having relations at Mr. Parker's, it was agreed that they might call and get his people. I remained at the gate on the road with 7 or 8, the others going across the field to the house about a half a mile off. After waiting some time for them, I became impatient and started to the house for them, and on our return we were met by a party of white men who had pursued our blood-stained track and who had fired on those at the gate and dispersed them, which I knew nothing of. Not having been at that time rejoined by any of them, immediately on discovering the whites, I ordered my men to halt and form, as they appeared to be alarmed. The white men, 18 in number, approached us in about 100 yards when one of them fired. This was against the positive orders of Captain Alexander P. Peet, who commanded and who had directed the men to reserve their fire until within 30 paces, and I discovered about half of them retreating. I then ordered my men to fire and rush on them. The few remaining stood their ground until we approached within 50 yards. When they fired and retreated, we pursued and overtook some of them who we thought we left dead. They were not killed. After pursuing them about 200 yards and rising a little hill, I discovered they were met by another party and had halted and were reloading their guns. This was a small party from Jerusalem, who knew the Negroes were in the field and had just tied their horses to await their return to the road, knowing that Mr. Parker and family were in Jerusalem, but knew nothing of the party that had gone in with Captain Pete. On hearing the firing, they immediately rushed to the spot and arrived just in time to arrest the progress of these barbarous villains and save the lives of their friends and fellow citizens, thinking that those who retreated first and the party who fired on us at 50 or 60 yards distant had all only fallen back to meet others with ammunition. As I saw them reloading their guns and more coming up than I saw at first, and several of my bravest men being wounded, the others became panic-struck and squandered over the field. The white men pursued and fired on us several times. Hark had his horse shot under him, and I caught another for him as it was running by me. 5 or 6 of my men were wounded, but none left on the field. Finding myself defeated here, I instantly determined to go through a private way and cross the Nottoway River at the Cypress Bridge 3 miles below Jerusalem and attack that place in the rear. As I expected, they would look for me on the other road, and I had a great desire to get there to procure arms and ammunition. After going a short distance in this private way, accompanied by about 20 men, I overtook 2 or 3 who told me the others were dispersed in every direction. After trying in vain to collect a sufficient force to proceed to Jerusalem, I determined to return, as I was sure they would make back to their old neighborhood, where they would rejoin me, make new recruits, and come down again. On my way back, I called at Mrs. Thomas's, Mrs. Spencer's, and several other places. The white families having fled, we found no more victims to gratify our thirst for blood. We stopped at Major Ridley's quarter for the night, and being joined by 4 of his men with the recruits made since my defeat, we mustered now about 40 strong. After placing out sentinels, I laid down to sleep, but was quickly roused by a great racket. Starting up, I found some mounted and others in great confusion. One of the sentinels, having given the alarm that we were about to be attacked, I ordered some to ride around and reconnoitre, and on their return, the others, being more alarmed, not knowing who they were, fled on in different ways, so that I was reduced to about 20 again. With this, I determined to attempt to recruit and proceed on to rally in the neighborhood. I had left Dr. Blunt's was the nearest house, which we reached just before day. On riding up the yard, Hark fired a gun. We expected Dr. Blunt and his family were at Major Ridley's. As I knew there was a company of men there, the gun was fired to ascertain if any of the family were at home. We were immediately fired upon and retreated, leaving several of my men. I do not know what became of them, as I never saw them afterwards. Pursuing our course back and coming in sight of Captain Harris's, where we had been the day before, we discovered a party of white men at the house, on which all deserted me but 2, Jacob and Nat. We concealed ourselves in the woods until near night, when I sent them in the search of Henry, Sam, Nelson, and Hark, and directed them to rally all they could at the place we had had our dinner the Sunday before, where they could find me, and I accordingly returned there as soon as it was dark, and remained until Wednesday morning, when discovering white men riding around the place as though they were looking for someone, and none of my men joining me, I concluded Jacob and Nat had been taken and compelled to betray me. On this, I gave up all hope for the present, and on Thursday night, after having supplied myself with provisions from Mr. Travis's, I scratched a hole under a pile of fence rails in a field, where I concealed myself for 6 weeks, never leaving my hiding place but for a few minutes in the dead of the night to get water, which was very near. Thinking by this time I could venture out, I began to go out in the night, eavesdropped the houses in the neighborhood, pursuing this course for about a fortnight and gathering little to no intelligence, afraid of speaking to any human being, and returning every morning to my cave before the dawn of day. I know not how long I might have led this life if accident had not betrayed me. A dog in the neighborhood passing by my hiding place one night while I was out was attracted by some meat I had in the cave and crawled in and stole it, and was coming out just as I returned. A few nights after, 2 Negroes having started to go hunting with the same dog and passed that way, the dog came again to the place, and having just gone out to walk about, discovered me and barked, on which, thinking myself discovered, I spoke to them to beg concealment. On making myself known, they fled from me, knowing then they would betray me. I immediately left my hiding place and was pursued almost incessantly until I had taken a fortnight afterwards by Mr. Benjamin Phipps in a little hole I had dug out with my sword for the purpose of concealment under the top of a fallen tree. On Mr. Phipps discovering the place of my concealment, he cocked his gun and aimed at me. I requested him not to shoot, and I would give up, upon which he demanded my sword. I delivered it to him, and he brought me to prison. During the time I was pursued, I had many hair-breadth escapes, which your time will not permit you to relate. I am here loaded with chains, and willing to suffer the fate that awaits me. I here proceeded to make some inquiries of him, after assuring him of certain death that awaited him, and that concealment would only bring destruction on the innocent, as well as guilty of his own color, if he knew of any extensive or concerted plan. His answer was, I do not. When I questioned him as to the insurrection in North Carolina happening about the same time, he denied any knowledge of it. The white people were so scared in North Carolina. What? He organized shit in North Carolina and in Georgia too. I know he did. White people are scared, insecure fucking bunts. That's why they beat their kids. North Carolina happening about this, they're scared of their kids. That's why he denied any knowledge of it. And when I looked him in the face as though I would search his inmost thoughts, he replied, I see, sir, you doubt my word, but can you not think the same ideas and strange appearances about this time in the heavens might prompt others, as well as myself, to do this undertaking? I now had much conversation with and asked him many questions, having forborne to do so previously, except in the cases noted in parentheses. But during his statement, I had unnoticed by him taking notes as to some particular circumstances, and having the advantage of his statement before me in writing on the evening of the third day that I had been with him, I began a cross-examination and found his statement corroborated by every circumstance coming within my own knowledge of the confessions of others whom had either been killed or executed, and whom he had not seen nor had any knowledge since the 22nd of August. Since the 22nd of August last, he expressed himself fully satisfied as to the impracticability of his attempt. It has been said that he was ignorant and cowardly, and that his object was to murder and rob for the purpose of obtaining money to make his escape. It is notorious that he was never known to have $1 in his life, to swear an oath, to drink a drop of spirits. As to his ignorance, he certainly never had the advantages of education, but he could read and write. It was taught to him by his parents, and for the natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension, it's surpassed by few men I've ever seen. As to him being a coward, his reason as given for not resisting Mr. Phipps shows the decision of his character. When he saw Mr. Phipps present his gun, he said he knew it was impossible for him to escape, as the woods were full of men. He therefore thought it was better to surrender and trust to fortune for his escape. He is a complete fanatic, or plays the part most admirably on other subjects. He possesses an uncommon share of intelligence, with a mind capable of attaining anything, but warped and perverted by the influence of early impressions. He is below the ordinary stature, though strong and active, having the true Negro face, every feature of which is strongly marked. I shall not attempt to describe the effect of his narrative, as told and commented on by himself in the condemned hole of the prison. The calm, deliberate composure with which he spoke of his late deeds and intentions, the expression of his fiend-like face when excited by enthusiasm, still bearing the stains of the blood of helpless innocence about him, clothed with rags and covered with chains, yet daring to raise his manacled hands to heaven, with the spirit soaring above the attributes of man. I looked on him, and my blood curdled in my veins. I will not shock the feelings of humanity, nor wound afresh the bosoms of the disconsolate sufferers. God damn. Da-da-da-da-da. This guy goes on. Okay, so Levi Waller introduced. Colonel Tresvant. Mr. Gray. Jeremiah Cobb. Nat Turner, stand up. Have you anything to say why a sentence of death should not be pronounced against you? I have not. I made a full confession to Mr. Gray. I have nothing more to say. Attend then to the sentence of the court. You have been arraigned and tried before this court, convicted of one of the highest crimes in our criminal code. You have been convicted of plotting in cold blood the indiscriminate destruction of men, women, children. He's basically just being a Putin. Nat Turner, he was the original Putin. But apparently the conservatives didn't like this Putin. The conservatives did not like this Putin at all.